When it's really hot in the loft or I want to work outside on big projects, I use these plastic trestles, but I always wish I had something a little bit more robust, so I came up with this folding bench. Come with me over the next 10 minutes and I'll show you how I made it. This project uses mostly inch by 4 and inch by 6 timbers, and the first job to do was to cut them roughly to length and then cut them down to inch by 2s and then regulise them so they was all the same size. Then, putting the grooving blade in my saw and my grooving fence, I put grooves in 1 inch of most of the timbers. Now I add my stock components. The next job is just to mark them out to make sure that I had the 6 frames I needed to build the project. In total there are 6 frames, 5 of which have panels. And then take them back to the crosscut saw just to cut them to the final size. Day 2. Last night I bobbed up into the loft just to get ready for today because I knew it was going to be hot. In fact, it's the hottest day of the year, so I thought set up last night when it was relatively cool and get started early this morning, because what I needed to do was actually not going to be noisy to disrupt the neighbours. And then I was just sliding into bed last night and I realised I made a bit of a boo-boo because I'd used my saw for the grooves on the small rails. I actually need to continue that groove around. Now it's not really ideal to do that on the saw. First of all, I forgot to do it, and secondly, a bit too dangerous with such a small area. So I really need to do it on the router, and I couldn't really run the router at 6:30 this morning, so I'm going to have to set my router up and do that. Sadly surprising really that I make a bit of a boo-boo from time, because I don't actually plan any of these builds. The plans are in my head. In fact, if it's still here, the markings and scribblings on this piece of wood is my entire plans. I need to set the router up and put some grooves in along the short edges. So with my groovy blade in the router and my push block, I ran all the pieces through and just continued the grooves around the edge. And then, using my Craig pocket hole jig, I put some screws in to hold the frames together whilst I was assembling them. I used some 9mm plywood as loose tenons, and as this glue gun had arrived that day, I thought I'd use it to glue the tenons into the grooves. And these are the components prior to assembly. To assemble, I glued the rails into the stiles, made sure they were square, and then inserted a couple of pocket hole screws just to keep the thing together while the glue set. Once 3 sides have been assembled, I measured the inside dimension and then, using my track saw, cut out the panels, and then finally glued on the 4th side. I used PVA glue here just to give me slightly more open time while I got the panels together. Here I am repeating the process with the larger back panel. And before I went any further, I give all the panels a rough sanding. It was now time to fit all the hinges. In the total there are 16 of them. These are just cheap 2-inch steel butt hinges, fastened with 2 screws to each panel. The 2 end panels are hinged so they fold inwards against each other, whilst the joint between the back and front panel and the end panels are hinged so the ends fold inwards. It took a little bit of time just to play around with them until they fit perfectly. Once I had both short sides and one long side fitted together, I then took these out of the loft as I wouldn't be able to get them out otherwise. Now out of the loft I could finally fasten the 2 parts together. I was thankful once it was all together that it worked. It would have been a lot of wasted time if not. With the frame finally finished, I could now turn my attention to the top. First of all, it was a case of marking it out so the top of the frames would actually poke through. This holds it all together and keeps the whole thing square in use. I cut a couple of holes with my drill and then, using the jigsaw, cut out the inner hole and then the notches for the legs on the corners. And after a little bit of playing around, the whole thing fit perfectly. And then repeating the whole process at the other end of the top. There, perfect. Back in the loft I made 3 more pieces to complete the front assembly. I wanted to drill a series of holes so I could mount clamps and dogs. So I drilled these out with a 20mm Forstner bit, totally ruining my blueprint in the process. Now with the bench collapsed, I put some chamfers on with a router and gave it a final sanding. And then I drilled the same 20mm holes at 100mm centres down the bench. Trimmed the bench top to length, ran the router around, and then just gave the whole thing a final sanding, ensuring that the little tenons that were poking through from the frame were at the exact same height as the bench top. Now that the bench was operational and I christened it with my cup of tea, just the final job was to fit the frame at the front. These are all glued in with loose tongues I made from offcuts of pine. The 2 end pieces are glued permanently. The centre stile is loose and slides up and down on the loose tongues. This is so the front of the bench is reconfigurable and can be adapted to different projects. And the very last job was just to give the whole thing a coat of quick drying varnish, just to give it some extra protection from wear and tear. And there we are, finished. I hope you enjoyed this project. If so, give me a thumbs up and please consider subscribing to my channel. I've got another project coming next week. Until then, bye.